What's up everybody? Today we are going to be talking about what you need to know before you buy a Cuban False Chameleon. Let's get started. Cuban False Chameleons, absolutely amazing reptiles, and even better, one of the more handleable reptiles that I've had experience of owning. And to make things even better, they are diurnal species, so they are active during the day. They do sleep at night, which makes it even better for you to actively be able to observe them during the day. What do you need to know before you buy a Cuban False Chameleon? There's a few things that I want to hit on, mostly pertaining to the care of a Cuban False Chameleon, because although I would say that they're not an expert level reptile, I wouldn't say that they're exactly an easy reptile to take care of either, and the reason being is the humidity that they require inside of their enclosure. So a Cuban False Chameleon does require a humidity level of about 80% overnight, and then you have between 50 and 80% during the day. So you can let it drop a little bit during the day, but it does require 80% at night. And it is a little bit difficult to achieve this without having a bioactive enclosure. So I do highly recommend a bioactive if you are getting a Cuban False Chameleon. If you live in a more dry climate, or your house alternatively stays dry because you live in a colder climate during the winter, you might have to get things like a fogger or consistently mist a few times a day to keep that humidity up. We all know the problems that come with having a fogger, meaning you have to clean that fogger regularly. I cannot stress that enough. If you have a fogger for any of your reptiles, make sure you are cleaning that fogger regularly, because they do build up bacteria in no time at all. In fact, if you don't clean it regularly, you can go to your fogger right now, pick the water base up and just look in the bottom, and I bet there'll be all this yellow gunky stuff in the bottom. Make sure you're cleaning that out immediately. This bacteria can be very bad for your reptiles, and they are breathing that in every day, so make sure your foggers are clean. Next thing we want to talk about is Cuban False Chameleons are picky eaters. They can be extremely picky eaters, and they can get bored of what you're feeding them. And what I mean by that is, if you are consistently feeding dubia roaches, which is a great primary diet for a Cuban False Chameleon, they could just one day decide that they don't want to eat dubias anymore. Maybe you're feeding crickets as a primary diet. Maybe one day they'll decide that they don't want crickets anymore. They can be very picky eaters, and it's just something that you need to take note of. If your Cuban False Chameleon just stops eating one day, consider switching from crickets to dubias, dubias to crickets, or snails. Snails are even better if you have access to them. Some Cuban False Chameleons do like rapashi, grub pie, so you can work in grub pie a few days. What I recommend while having a Cuban False Chameleon is don't feed them the same thing every day. Have a rotation available for them. One day do dubias, the next day do crickets. Work in some rapashi grub pie. If you have access to snails, be sure that the snails come from a good location, a reputable snail breeder, so you know that they're not coming with parasites. They love snails. They're naturally snail eaters in the wild. So keep them on a rotation, rotate out the food to make sure that they're not getting bored of what you're feeding them, and then one day just stop eating and you have no idea why. The next thing to consider is dehydration. So dehydration is I wouldn't say very common, but it's something that you really need to watch out for with a Cuban False Chameleon. They will drink out of a mister and a dripper, but they generally will not drink out of still water. And depending on your enclosure, sometimes a mist or a dripper just isn't enough for them. So what I do is I have a bottle with a little nozzle on it, and I'll actually drip water in front of their face until they drink it. I'll do that almost daily with my Cuban False Chameleons. So just know that you might have to hand water your Cuban False Chameleon. If you do not physically see it drinking from the mister or from the dripper that you have in the enclosure, you need to hand water them daily to make sure they're getting the water that they need. And then the last thing I want to bring up is calcium. Make sure that you are providing your Cuban False Chameleon with the proper vitamins and calcium supplements, making sure that if you have a female and they're laying eggs, they do lay duds, but they don't have to be with a male to lay eggs. They will lay duds before they're mated, which can crash their calcium. So make sure you are providing them the appropriate calcium, the proper UVB. They absolutely 100%, with no questions asked, need a UVB, and just make sure that you are dusting their food appropriately. So aside from that, the last thing we want to bring up is just enclosure size. If you have a Cuban False Chameleon, I do recommend that you get a 36-inch high enclosure. I know that the requirements or the minimums online will say 24, but I do require a 36-inch high. They will use the space. They love to climb up high, and make sure you get thin branches. They don't like thick branches or big cork bark. They might use it to climb up, but make sure you have thin vines, no bigger than the width of their body. That's what they prefer to hang out on. That's what they prefer to climb. So just make sure that you have the appropriate branches and vines for them to be able to comfortably hang out in the enclosure. And one just quick tip for you guys, they don't have the best traction or the best grip when they're trying to climb up branches. So if you do have branches that have a smooth bark, a good option is vet wrap, like you would use on a dog's foot if it got injured. You could buy it at most pet stores. But if you wrap the branch in that vet tape, it'll actually give them the grip that they need to climb up those sticks and branches. And that's what I think you need to know before you buy a Cuban False Chameleon. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one.